I wrote the first line of code in a rented room above a laundromat in San Francisco in January, 3 years ago. I remember the exact line because I have it saved in a personal repository that predates the company's founding by 7 months, which turned out to be the most important 7 months of my life. The company was called Vertex. Vertex was a data infrastructure platform, the kind of product that is deeply unsexy to describe and deeply necessary once you understand it. It sat between enterprise applications and their underlying databases and made every operation faster, cheaper, and more reliable than any competing solution. I built the core architecture. It worked because the architecture was correct. The architecture was correct because I had been thinking about the problem for 3 years before I wrote the first line. Marco Vidal joined 6 months after I started building. Marco was 26, brilliantly charismatic, and possessed of the specific ability that I entirely lack, walking into a room of people who have money and making them want to give it to you. That is not a small skill. That is, in the startup world, an enormous skill. I needed it and he had it, and we made an arrangement. The arrangement was this. I built the product, Marco built the company around it. I took the technical title and he took the CEO role, and we split the equity. It made sense at the time. It continued to make sense right up until the board meeting on the morning of our IPO roadshow. Jade Lin was our VP of marketing, the woman who took the technical reality of what I had built and translated it into language that investors understood, customers wanted, and journalists could write about. She was 26, and she was excellent at her work, and she had been living in the apartment I was paying for on my co-founder's salary for 2 years. She had also, for approximately 7 months of that time, been with Marco. I did not know this yet on the morning of the board meeting. I knew it by the afternoon. The afternoon was a very educational period. Brett Hayward called the board meeting. Brett was our lead board member, a venture partner at one of the Valley's established funds, the kind of investor who had opinions about leadership transitions before a founding team had finished their first product. He had backed 3 companies to significant exits and had made his career on knowing when to make a change and making it cleanly. He made it cleanly. The meeting was at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, the same Tuesday our IPO roadshow was scheduled to begin. I found out about the meeting at 8:53 when Jade forwarded me a calendar invite with no message attached. I walked into the boardroom and found Marco, Jade, Brett, and 2 lawyers I had never seen before. The energy in the room had the specific quality of a decision that has already been made and is now being communicated. I have since learned to recognize this quality immediately. In that moment, it took me about 45 seconds. Brett chaired the meeting. He used phrases like leadership evolution and technical to operational transition. He explained that the board had voted 4-1, with Marco casting one of the 4, to restructure the CTO role. I was transitioning out of day-to-day operations. A new CTO would be appointed from outside. My replacement was, I later learned, someone Marco had been interviewing for 3 weeks. The part that required the lawyers, a clawback clause in my vesting agreement, one I had designed myself, 8 months earlier, for early employees who departed before certain performance milestones, was being applied to 30% of my vested shares. The performance milestone in question was a technical one, tied to platform scalability metrics. The metrics had, according to Brett, not been met. The metrics had been met. I had the documentation. But contesting it in that room at that moment with those lawyers was not the right move. The Nexus system had not yet activated. I was still operating on instinct and incomplete information. I asked if I could take the settlement paperwork with me to review. Brett said, of course. I picked it up, thanked everyone in the room by name, and walked out. In the corridor, I passed the glass wall of the room where Marco was already on his next call. Jade's phone was on the table next to his laptop, face up, unlocked. I did not stop walking. I had seen enough. I drove to the apartment. It took 23 minutes. I spent those 23 minutes in the specific state of a person who understands what they have just learned, but has not yet decided what to do with it. Her things were there when I arrived. She had not been home since the morning. I sat on the couch that I had bought in the apartment that was in my name, and I opened my laptop out of habit, the same habit that had brought me to a keyboard at 2 a.m. for 3 years. The Nexus system activated before I typed anything. It appeared the way systems appear when they have been waiting. Instantly, cleanly, without introduction. Asterisk Nexus system, online. Asterisk asterisk user, Evan Cole. Asterisk asterisk 0 point confirmed. Initiating full clarity protocol. Asterisk a second notification, quieter. Asterisk the architecture of every system you have encountered is now visible to you. Start where you want to. Asterisk I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I opened a new terminal window and started where I wanted to. I had always known the flaw was there. I had known it for 8 months, since the point where Vertex's user growth rate began outpacing what the original data handling layer could cleanly support. I had written 3 internal memos about it. All 3 had been tabled by Marco in favor of growth metrics for the roadshow. With the Nexus system active, the flaw was no longer a memo. It was a map. Every node in Vertex's architecture was visible to me simultaneously. Every connection, every dependency, every place where the data flow would begin to back up once the user threshold was crossed. The threshold was not abstract. At Vertex's current growth rate, the platform would hit it in 14 to 18 months. At that point, the performance degradation would be material and visible to customers. The IPO prospectus did not disclose this. I had raised it. It had not been included. I was not thinking about the IPO prospectus. I was thinking about the solution. The solution was a complete redesign of the data handling layer, a rebuild that Vertex's current codebase could not absorb without essentially starting over, which meant the company that solved this problem would not be Vertex. It would be whoever built it correctly from the beginning. I opened a new repository. I named it NextGen. I committed the first architecture document at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I sublet a room. I bought a standing desk and a second monitor from a hardware resale shop. I kept the same hours I had always kept because those hours were not a discipline. They were a preference. I had always found work easier than sleep when the problem was interesting, and this problem was the most interesting I had encountered in 3 years. The Nexus system did not write the code. I wrote the code. What the Nexus system provided was complete visibility into every decision's downstream consequence. I could see, before committing a single line, exactly how a given architectural choice would behave at 10 times the scale, 100 times the scale, 1,000. Every function I wrote was written once. I had spent 3 years patching other people's decisions at midnight. NextGen had no other people's decisions in it. Suki Tanaka was the best infrastructure engineer I had ever hired. She was 25, and she had been implementing my architecture at Vertex for 3 years, which meant she understood it at the level of someone who has lived inside a system rather than someone who has only read its documentation. She resigned from Vertex on a Wednesday, 6 days after the board meeting. She showed up at my sublet on the following Monday morning with a laptop, a mechanical keyboard, and a coffee she had made herself before knocking on my door. She said, "I saw what they did. Where do I start?" I showed her the NextGen repository. She read the architecture document for 8 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "This is correct." That was the entire conversation. She pulled up a chair and started working. Having Suki on the team meant 2 things. It meant the build would move twice as fast. It also meant that someone who had been inside Vertex's architecture for 3 years had looked at my new approach and called it correct. That second thing mattered in a way the first thing did not. NextGen's first enterprise customer came from an unexpected direction. A company that had been in conversations with Vertex for 6 months. A logistics firm whose data processing requirements were exactly the kind that Vertex's architecture would struggle to handle at scale. had quietly paused those conversations after the roadshow postponement and begun looking at alternatives. Their CTO had read a technical thread I had posted publicly in my own name about architectural approaches to high-volume data handling. He reached out. I did not pitch him. I sent him a working demo of NextGen's core data layer and let it demonstrate itself. He signed a letter of intent within 2 weeks. The demo was enough because the solution was correct. Correct solutions are underrated in the startup world, where narrative often outpaces product. I had spent 3 years watching this happen. Now I was on the other side of it. Raymond Cole, my grandfather, the man who had spent 50 years quietly shaping the foundational mathematics that made modern data systems possible, contacted me through his lawyers in the 5th week. Raymond was 74 and had the specific quality of a person who had done important work for a long time, without requiring anyone to acknowledge it. His patent portfolio covered algorithms I had grown up reading and had built my entire technical thinking on without consciously realizing I was building on his foundation. He said on a phone call that lasted 4 minutes, "The patent transfer is complete. The licensing agreement with Vertex expires in 90 days. Market rate renegotiation is your decision." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't thank me. Just make sure what you build next is worth the foundation." I said I would. I believed it. The current licensing rate Vertex was paying for Raymond's patents was a legacy figure from 8 years ago, a rate that represented approximately 1/5 of what the same portfolio would command at current market pricing. The patents were foundational to Vertex's entire platform. Without them, Vertex would need to rebuild from algorithms they did not have the in-house expertise to develop. I instructed my lawyers to send the renegotiation notice. Marco's response to NextGen's existence arrived in 2 forms. The first was a cease and desist letter from Vertex's legal team, claiming that NextGen's architecture misappropriated trade secrets from Vertex. The specific claims referenced code structures that I had written before the company was formed, structures that existed in my personal repository, with timestamps predating Vertex's founding by 7 months. I submitted those timestamps to my lawyers within an hour of receiving the letter. The legal team withdrew the cease and desist 3 weeks later without explanation. The second was a background briefing that Brett Hayward gave to a prominent tech journalist. The piece ran with phrases like "brilliant but difficult" and "technical visionary who struggled with the transition to scaled leadership." It quoted 2 unnamed sources. I had a reasonable hypothesis about who both sources were. I did not respond to the article directly. I published a single line on my technical blog. NextGen's architecture is publicly documented. The work speaks. I linked to the open source repository. The engineering community's response to the repository made the article irrelevant within 48 hours. 5 senior engineers from companies I respected posted public analyses of the architecture. Every analysis said the same thing in different words. "This is correct." Marco called me that night. I did not pick up. He left a voicemail that I listened to once and did not return. He sounded like a man who had made a decision he considered permanent and was discovering it was not. I published the white paper on a Monday. It was titled "Architectural Limitations in High-Throughput Data Platforms: A Technical Analysis." It named no companies. It described, precisely and in technical detail, the specific class of architectural decision that creates a scalability ceiling at a particular user threshold, the exact ceiling that existed in Vertex's platform. It proposed NextGen's approach as a solution. The paper was written in my name. It cited Raymond's foundational patents in the bibliography. By Tuesday afternoon, it had been read by engineers at 47 enterprise companies, 12 venture capital funds, and 3 IPO underwriting firms. I know the exact numbers because the server logs were precise. By Wednesday, Vertex's IPO underwriters had requested a technical review of the platform's scalability roadmap. By Thursday, the IPO roadshow was postponed. The official statement cited strategic timeline considerations. The patent renegotiation notice had arrived at Vertex's legal team the same Monday the paper published. The renegotiation requirement was not material on its own, but combined with the scalability question, it represented two simultaneous disclosures that Vertex's S1 did not currently contain. NextGen closed its series 3 weeks after the white paper published. The lead investor was a fund whose founding partner had known Raymond Cole since the 1990s and had been waiting, with the specific patience of someone who has good pattern recognition, to back the next generation of the same foundational approach. He led the round personally. The round was oversubscribed by a factor of 2.3. I did not make a statement about the round. I sent a brief update to our existing customers and went back to work. Suki had flagged a performance edge case in the data layer that I wanted to resolve before we onboarded the next enterprise client. The engineering problem was more interesting than the funding announcement. This was a good sign. NextGen went public 6 weeks after the series closed. I wore the same jacket I had worn to the Vertex board meeting, not as a statement, because I do not make statements with clothing, but because it was the right weight for the weather, and I had not thought about it beyond that until Suki pointed it out, and we both noted the irony and moved on. The listing was oversubscribed. The stock opened at 14% above the listing price. By close of trading, it was up 22. Jade called during the trading session. My phone was face down on my desk where it had been since the market opened. When trading closed, I turned it over. One missed call. Jade Lynn. I looked at it for a moment. I thought about the board meeting and the 2 lawyers and the note she had left in the apartment, warm, professional, and carefully worded. And I thought about the fact that her call was probably also warm, professional, and carefully worded. I turned the phone face down again. Suki looked over from her desk. She said, "Jade." I said, "Yes." She said, "Okay." That was the complete conversation. She went back to her screen. I went back to the whiteboard. Vertex went public 8 months later. Their S1 disclosed the scalability limitation as a known technical risk. Their stock opened below the listing price. By the end of the first trading day, it had recovered to approximately the listing price, which the financial press described as resilient. I read this and noted that resilient is what financial journalists say when they mean it did not go lower. I did not read this carefully. I noted it and moved on. Vertex's patent licensing fees, renegotiated to current market rates, were now a disclosed line item in their operating costs. The fees were significant. They were not paid to Vertex. They were paid to a holding company that managed Raymond Cole's estate portfolio, which I managed on his behalf. I am not going to pretend there was no satisfaction in that. There was. It was brief and precise and entirely proportional to 3 years of 2 AM patches for a codebase that someone else put their name on. Then I went back to work. It was late on the evening of the listing day, after everyone had left and the office was quiet, that I stood at the whiteboard and thought about the problem I had been circling for 2 weeks. NextGen's current architecture solved the scalability problem correctly. It was not the last problem. The Nexus system was showing me the next one, a different class of data handling challenge, at the intersection of real-time processing and long-term storage, that nobody had built a clean solution to yet. I had the beginning of an approach. I had written it in the upper left corner of the whiteboard in green marker, which is how I start every architecture I eventually build. The listing number was still on the screen across the room. I could see it from where I was standing. It was a good number. It was the result of doing the work correctly, which is always, eventually, what a good number is the result of. I turned back to the whiteboard. The problem in the upper left corner was more interesting.